So I want to welcome everyone worshiping today at Wexford, at East End. Maybe you're at Dormont, Oakland, or Sewickley Valley. We are thrilled that you are here. I want to send out a special welcome to anyone that is maybe joining us today for the first time at any of our locations. Welcome. Today we launch a new series that is actually the final installment of a much larger study that we've done throughout the year of the Judges of Israel. I will set that series up and sort of tell you where we're headed in a minute, but I want to give you a quick snapshot of where we'll be heading this fall with our preaching and teaching. At Northway, we often kick off the fall season with what I would call like an invite preaching series, right? Meaning a series with something intriguing that would be an easy invite for you to invite a friend to. We know that early in the fall like that, it's often a time when someone's possibly looking for a church or looking to come back to church. So we typically kick off the year with something that I would say maybe is like user-friendly. So last year, if you were here with us, we launched this series called The End in the Fall, and it was this conversation about what the Bible has to say about end times. 2 years ago in the fall, we kicked off the season with a series called My Own Worst Enemy, and we looked at the foolish things that we do. And then 3 years ago, we did this series called Renaissance, and it was a series about renewal of faith in our hearts. So this year, the teaching team decided to do something a little bit different, and we're going to come into this fall and directly teach to who Jesus is with a series titled The Ripple Effect. Now get this, here's the premise of this 4-week series that will launch the weekend after Labor Day. It's this, on the day after Jesus' death, it looked like whatever small mark that he had left on the earth was going to quickly disappear. Because his followers, they were scattered and hiding. His movement seemed to have failed, but shockingly, 2,000 and plus years later, his impact on the world is like no other person in the history of mankind. Whether or not you even believe he is God or not, you have to admit that his life has had this ripple effect that is unparalleled in all of history. Our calendar is based on his life. If you look at a map, you're going to see territories and cities and roads that were named after him or after his earlier followers. Pastor and author John Ortberg, in his book, Who Is This Man? He sums it up this way. He says this: we name our children after his disciples and early followers, Matthew and Mary and John. And we name our dogs and pizza shops after the rulers of his day, Caesar and Nero and Brutus. He goes on to say this: his teaching fueled the civil rights movements, formed the basis for the separation of church and state, elevated the status of women, led to the development of hospitals, and inspired the founding of the world's top universities. All of this from a man who never held public office, led an army, discovered a new land, or amassed a great fortune. So the weekend after Labor Day, we're going to kick off a conversation, and we're going to look at the impact that Jesus had. And then the following 3 weeks are going to be quite simple. We're going to, because we believe this, if you really truly understand the impact that he has and you want to follow him, then you need to understand week 2, his character, week 3, his ways, and week 4, his mission. We want us this fall at Northway, across all of our locations, to really understand who Jesus is and really make a decision whether or not we want to follow him with all of our heart. And then in October, we are going to launch a 4-part series that will be really a series that we want you to invite your friends out to. It's a 4-part series, and we've titled it 4 Questions. That's pretty creative and catchy, right? This is a series that you're going to want to bring your friends to. Friends that have questions or doubts about God. And we've identified what we feel are 4 questions that folks in Western Pennsylvania struggle with sometimes when it comes to God. So here are the weeks in that series. The first question is this: don't all roads lead to heaven? Had anybody say that to you? The second week, we're going to say, does suffering disprove God? Because of all the suffering in the world, does that show that God can't possibly care? In week 3, we're going to look at this question: does religion, as long as I got religion in my life, that's what I need, right? And then the 4th week, does science disprove God? So that's where we're headed. after we wrap up the series that we're in today. So if you're new with us, we kicked off the study of the Judges back in January. And I opened that series, if you recall, with looking at the last few chapters of the book of Judges. And it's frankly probably one of the most disturbing sections or stories in the entire Bible. Like seriously, some disturbing stuff. Andy Stanley, a pastor in Atlanta, he once described it as the last couple chapters of Judges, it's Nightmare on Elm Street meets Deliverance. I mean, it is really some gritty stuff. And that's where we kicked this series off. And then we dove in to the first three judges. If you recall that, right? Othniel, the nephew of Caleb, this stud sort of warrior, I called him. And then in the next time, we looked at Ehud, right? The lefty that took a king out while he was in his bathroom. Remember that story, right? And then the third, judge we looked at was, there's only one verse to describe the third judge, Shamgar, son of Anath, who killed 600 Philistines with an ox goad. Basically took out an army unit with a stick, right? And then in March, we came back as part of the live teaching tour, and we looked at Deborah, then Gideon, then Abimelech, and then Jephthah. And then if you're with us in this past June, Pastor Kent took us to the man cave, right? And we looked at the life of Samson. And the final two judges in these series of judges, they're found in the book of 1 Samuel. Eli and Samuel are the last two judges. And we wanted to include all of the judges of Israel, which means we needed to move out of the book of Judges and actually into 1 Samuel in order to catch Eli and Samuel. So Eli this week, Samuel next week, and then the final 2 weeks, here's what we're going to do. Samuel, he anoints Saul as king of Israel. The people wanted a king. And Samuel, the final judge, anoints Saul, which moves the nation of Israel from a theocracy to a monarchy. And we're going to look at that. In fact, we're going to be live teaching at all of our campuses on that weekend. And the final weekend of this series, I'm going to be back up. And here's what we're going to do. We're going to look at the first three kings of Israel. Saul, the people's choice. David, God's choice. And the third week, we're going to look at Absalom in this final week. The guy who basically started a coup against his dad. He chose himself to be king. And what I found in my study is this is going to bring us right back to the very last verse in the book of Judges. There's no king in Israel, and everyone did what was right in their own eyes. So we'll literally land this entire study right back to where we began. So the story of Eli, it's found in chapters 1 through 4 of the book of 1 Samuel. And I'm going to really give you a high sort of umbrella overview of Eli's story as I'm going to bounce through those chapters rather quickly. These scriptures are in your notes. They'll be up on your screens. But if you've got your Bible, 1 Samuel chapter 1, we find Eli in his role as priest at Shiloh. And we're introduced to Hannah, who we'll see is going to be Samuel's mother. And in verse 9, it says this: Now Eli, the priest, was sitting on the seat beside the doorpost of the temple of the Lord. She was deeply distressed, that's Hannah they're talking about there, and prayed to the Lord and wept bitterly. And she vowed a vow and said, O Lord of hosts, if you will indeed look on the affliction of your servant and remember me and not forget your servant, but will give to your servant a son. See, she'd been unable to have children. Then I will give him to the Lord all the days of his life, and no razor shall touch his head. Hannah, she's desperately praying for a child. And she tells God, if you give me this baby, I will give him back to you. I will assure you, Lord, that he will know you, and I will have him serve you at the temple. And Eli, it says, it goes on to say that he actually thought she was drunk because of how passionately she was praying. And eventually Hannah does have a son, and it's Samuel, who we're going to see serves under Eli in the temple at Shiloh, and we'll learn more about that next week. In chapter 2, we are told about Eli's sons. In one verse sums them up. Verse 12, it says this: Now the sons of Eli were worthless men. They did not know the Lord. And the text goes on to say this about his sons, that they were claiming the animal sacrifices that the people that were bringing to the temple for themselves. They were eating the best portions of the sacrifices, right? And it also says that they were having sex with the young women that worked at the temple. And one commentary says this of Eli's sons. It says this. It says, they forced themselves upon the meat of the temple, the ladies at the temple, and the goodwill of the worshipers. God's people were abused, God's place was desecrated, and God's provision was stolen. And it says in one section here that Eli goes and talks to his sons about there, tells them they should not do such things, but he does nothing to stop them. And in verse 26, we see this contrast between Eli's sons and Samuel, who's growing up in the temple. Verse 26, it says this, now the boy Samuel continued to grow both in stature and in favor with the Lord and also with men. Samuel is growing closer to God, and Eli and his family is moving away, right? And God informs Eli at the end of chapter 2 that he's going to remove him and that someone else is going to lead his nation. In chapter 3, we find this great exchange between Eli and young Samuel. If you've grown up in church, you probably maybe have even heard this story before told to you in Sunday school, or you've seen it taught in church. It's an amazing exchange. In the middle of the night, God calls out to Samuel. And Samuel, he's sleeping, and he thinks that it's Eli that's calling him from the next room. So in verse 5, it says this in chapter 3, here I am, for you called me. But he said, so this is Eli talking, I didn't call. Lie down again. So he went and lay down. And the Lord called again, Samuel. And Samuel arose, and he went over to Eli again and said, here I am, for you called me. But he said, I did not call you, my son. Lie down again. And it happens a third time. And this time Eli finally realizes that maybe God is calling you, Samuel. And he tells Samuel that if it happens again, that Samuel is just supposed to say, speak, Lord, for your servant hears. And God does indeed, in that moment, in that temple, speak to Eli. But what he tells him is difficult. He tells him what's going to happen to Eli's family. So God says this in verse 13, and I declare to him that I am about to punish his house forever for the iniquity, the sin that he knew because his sons were blaspheming God and he did nothing to restrain them. And then chapter 4, we see the close of Eli's life. There's these two epic battles. The Philistines, once again, are battling against Israel, and Israel loses both of those encounters. In the second encounter, Eli's sons are killed, and the Ark of the Covenant is captured by the Philistines. And Eli, he's sitting judge over Israel, and he's given a report from a man that has literally fled from the battlefield. And here's the report. It's in chapter 4, verse 17. He tells Eli this, Israel has fled before the Philistines, and there has also been a great defeat among our people. And your two sons also, Hophni and Phinehas, are dead. And the ark of God has been captured. And as soon as he mentioned the ark of God, Eli fell over backward from his seat by the side of the gate, and his neck was broken, and he died. For the man was old and heavy. And it says here that he judged Israel for 40 years. I want to talk in a moment about Eli as the judge of Israel. But before I do that, I just want to look at three things of Eli as the parent. And I put these in your notes, and I want to sort of talk to all of us, or all of you that may be parents today. Eli did not parent well. And here are three things that I dug out of this text as I was studying it. One, the text tells us that he did not raise his children to know God. You know, in the church, there's traditions about like infant baptism, right? Bringing babies forward to be baptized. At Northway, we do baby dedications. And just so that you know, that is really way more about the parents than it is about the baby, right? I mean, the parents are basically in that moment taking this huge responsibility on. They're standing up before God and before their church, and they're saying, I plan on raising this child, this baby, to know the ways of God. And and I have heard parents sometimes say something along this lines. I'm going to let my child decide their faith on their own. Maybe you've had someone say this to you. I'm not going to force my faith on them. And when they're old enough and ready, they can decide. Listen, if you're not a God follower, that's maybe an okay stance to take. But I just want to be perfectly clear with us. If you believe in God, if you are a Christ follower, that is not a biblical stance. It simply is not. The Bible makes it clear as believers, we are to lead our children in the character and the ways and the mission of Jesus. And then at some point, yeah, they will make their own decision, but it's supposed to be an informed decision. Eli's boys did not know God. The second thing that the text reveals is that Eli was actually participating in the ill-gotten gain of the stolen meat sacrifices. He was actually eating them too. It says he was getting fat on them. In 1 Samuel chapter 2, verse 29, God rebukes Eli, and he says this, "Why do you scorn my sacrifice and offering that I prescribed for my dwelling? Why do you honor your sons more than me by fattening yourself on the choice parts of every offering made by my people?" Can I just say something here, right? It's really hard to discipline our kids when we are telling them to do something or telling them not to do something that we are doing, right? It's pretty hard to say to your kids, hey, you got to get a hold of your anger. You got to stop losing your temper. But then you constantly, blow up. It's pretty hard to say to your kids, right, don't speak to your mother that way while you're demeaning or insulting her. It's pretty hard to say to your kids, don't be dishonest, but you have them lie about their age in order to get into a movie or a park at a discount rate, right? Eli, he did go and speak to his kids about their behavior. The text says that. But didn't carry any weight or pack any punch because he was participating in the same poor behavior. I mean, this second point is sort of simple, right? It's just that we can't do the old do what I say, not what I do with our kids. We've got to model it. And the third thing is this, that Eli, it says that he honored his kids more than he loved God. God said to him, why do you honor your boys more than you do me? There's such a contrast here because there's this woman in Israel named Hannah who was barren. And she goes to God and says, God, if you just give me I promise I will raise him to know you. And she fulfills that promise, and he goes on to be one of the greatest prophets, judges, and leaders of Israel because she was faithful to God. Eli was not a good parent, and there are some challenging messages in there for us, right? For all of us, For me, am I raising my children to know God? What behaviors am I living out in front of them that maybe contrast the ways of God? Do I place my kids above God in my heart? Parents, particularly those of you that are God followers, it's a huge responsibility and a difficult task to raise our kids. And I think the first thing you got to do is get on your knees and pray a lot. Eli did not set up a good example of being a biblical parent, right? We don't know much about the scriptures of Eli's sort of early years as judge, but here's one thing that we do know. At the end of Eli's term as a judge over Israel, Israel was a mess. Israel was spiritually bankrupt. They were divided politically. They were in economic and military chaos. Do you guys know that Eli was a priest from the line of Aaron, the brother of Moses? He was in such a prominent position. He had so much authority and opportunity to lead well, right? He was a priest at Shiloh. He was the judge of Israel. For 40 years, this incredible opportunity to leverage his influence, to lead a nation and to honor God. And based on the status of the nation at the time of his death, it's fair to assume that he did not seize this opportunity to follow God. He did not lead his people well. In fact, I would even speculate, right, that maybe those around him wouldn't even have known that he was a God follower by watching his everyday life. So can I just ask us all a question for everyone today, and this is me included. Can people identify you as a God follower by the way you go about your life? by what you do, by what you say, by how you react, what kind of employee you are, by how you treat your family. Not because you got a fish bumper sticker on the back of your car, right? Or that you tell people that you go to church. I mean by the way you live and by the way you lead. I don't think Eli would have been viewed or seen as a God follower. What about you? What about me? See, I want to dig into that question just for a minute, and I want to look at a story that's found in the book of Acts, chapters 3 and 4. Jesus' death and resurrection have already taken place at this time of the story, and now Jesus' followers, they're gaining momentum and followers as they preach and teach in around Jerusalem. Two of those disciples are named Peter and John, and they're headed to the temple. They show up at the temple one day, and they encounter a lame beggar, it says. And I love it. Peter says to him, "Look up at me." So this lame beggar that's been sitting there for years looks up at Peter, and Peter says this to them, "I have no silver or gold, but what I do have I give to you in the name of Jesus Christ of Nazareth. Rise up and walk." And that's what this guy does. If you know this story, right? He rises up and he makes quite a scene because it says he's jumping around. And the people are like, what in the world is going on? And now this healed man is sort of clinging to Peter. And Peter has this opportunity to leverage his influence and his voice that he's been given. And he tells the people what's going on and who Jesus is. And it says that many in that crowd there, they believed right on the spot. But this angered the religious leaders of the temple. And they had Peter and John thrown into jail, right? And the next day, it's recorded that John and Peter, they're brought before the religious leaders of the area, and they're questioned again. And Peter just gets up, and at the end of chapter 3 and beginning of chapter 4, and he just tells the religious leader what he knows. He says, he performed many miracles, and he taught about the kingdom of God. He predicted his own death and resurrection, and as far as I know, he's the only person to ever pull that off. And you killed him, and God raised him, and we saw him, and we should all say we're sorry. That's what he said right in front of the religious leaders of the time. And then in Acts 4, Peter goes on to say this, or this story goes on. Here's what happens. Acts 4, verse 13. Now when they saw the boldness of Peter and John and perceived that they were uneducated common men, they were astonished, these religious leaders. And they recognized that they had been with Jesus. I'm going to come back to that. But seeing the man who was healed, standing beside them, they had nothing to say in opposition. But when they had commanded them to leave the council, so they asked Peter and John to step out for a minute, they conferred with one another, saying, "What shall we do with these men? For that a notable sign has been performed through them is evident to all the inhabitants of Jerusalem, and we can't deny it. But in order that it may not spread any further among the people, let us warn them to speak no more of anyone in this name." So they called them back into the room, and they charged them not to speak or teach at all in the name of Jesus. But Peter and John answered them, "Whether it is right in the sight of God to listen to you rather than to God, you must judge. For we cannot but speak of what we have seen and heard." And when they had further threatened them, they let them go, finding no way to punish them because of the people, for all were praising God for what had happened. Just a side note here. Do you know what happens next? Peter and John, they gather up with the other believers, and it says they pray for boldness. They didn't pray for more miracles. They didn't pray for more, great speeches. They prayed for boldness to continue to get out there and do that, right? Uneducated common men. And it says that when they saw their courage, it doesn't say when they saw the miracle they did, oh, they must be with Jesus. No, it says when they saw their courage, they knew that these guys had been with Jesus. It's not their eloquent speech. It's not this unbelievable miracle that just happened. It's their courage. See, when you are connected to Jesus, you are alive, and your faith gives you courage. I don't believe that Eli was connected to God. Let me sidetrack here for just a minute. So I never played organized football growing up, even though I really loved football, understand football, liked watching it, but I never played. And here's why. Because I was a really little, scrawny kid. Like seriously, in 9th grade, I was the second smallest boy in the entire school, right? Because they had us line up in gym class from shortest to tallest. And dude, there was only one person on my right, Robbie Scott. I still remember him. I was the littlest guy in the class, right? And our gym teacher that year was the wrestling coach. And in the first week of school, I remember he approached me and Robbie and he asked us how much we weighed. And honest to goodness, I weighed 95 pounds. And Robbie, he weighed 110. So the coach says to me, I want you to be on the wrestling team because we don't have a 98-pound wrestler. And he didn't really ask. Like, I was just sort of told, I want you to be on the wrestling team. And I had never wrestled in my life. If you guys know me, I grew up sort of doing some boxing. So the one thing I knew about wrestling is you weren't allowed to punch anybody. So I knew I was going to be like at a disadvantage right away. I knew no moves, no nothing. 2 practices, and it's time for the first match, right? And my first match was against the guy that won the WPIL championship at 98 pounds the previous year. And let me tell you, there's only one thing maybe more embarrassing than getting pinned in 13 seconds in front of your classmates. It's wearing a singlet in front of your classmates and getting pinned in 13 seconds. That's not a flattering uniform for a 95-pound boy, right? A singlet. I finished up the season 3-8. Truth be told, 2 of them were forfeits because the other team didn't have a 98-pound wrestler, and I think the other one might have been a girl. And it's a story for another sermon. Luckily, I grew a little the next year and gained some weight, and that mercilessly ended my wrestling career. And here's the thing. I actually grew 10 inches between the end of my junior year and my end of my first year at college. I was, for whatever reason, grew super, super late. So I never played football, because I was always just this little dude. And when I went to college, I joined a fraternity. Shocking, I bet, right? Edinburgh, Signu, right? So the frats, they played each other in football every year. And our frat took this really serious. Like, they had plays. They had playbooks. They studied for days. And it was all made up of kids that had played high school football, played like at a really serious level. So I never played. And it turns out in our Greek games, the fall of 1982, we were short a few players because it seems that some of my fellow frat brothers were suspended from school, something to do with not going to class at all for the first month. So I was asked to play, right? And I had no time to learn the plays or anything like that, but I sort of understood football. And I remember this one guy telling me I was going to play defensive end. And he said, here's a very simple instruction I'm going to give you for this whole game. Show up at the ball. That's it. That's all you need to know. If they're running, show up there and tackle them. If the ball's thrown, show up there and try to catch it or tackle the person that catches it. And I was a decent athlete, so I thought I could do that, and I did, and we won. And, I'd like to tell you I scored the winning touchdown or made a miraculous catch. No, nothing like that. Here's what I did. I just kept showing up. I just kept showing up at the ball. And Peter and John, they were ordinary, uncommon, uneducated men who knew Jesus and just kept showing up. They just showed up at the temple that morning. They didn't have any idea what God was going to do, what he was going to provide for them. They just showed up, connected to Jesus. That's all I want to do in my walk with Jesus. I just want to have the courage to keep showing up because I want to show up and praise the one who showed up for me on the cross. The one who believed in me before I ever believed in him. Jesus was willing to be identified with me. Why in the world would I not want to be identified with him? See, if I stay connected to him, then the way I live my life will be an expression of him to those I come in contact with. Not because of any miracle that I can do, or any eloquent speech that I might be able to give. It will be because I will be accountable to whatever leadership or influence that I have been given. And I show up. And I'm connected and identifying with Jesus. And that starts at home. And then from there, it moves out to wherever or whatever God places in your path. You show up. See, when you show up connected to Jesus, God shows up. Folks, God believes in us. He put his love in us and expects us to share that with others. His strategy is to appeal to the world through us. Speaking about Jesus in the gospel, it says, he took our sin upon himself so that we might be the righteousness of God. God has placed everything on this. It's on us to be reconciled to God and then to live a life that reflects God's beauty, his wonder, his holiness, and his compassion, so that those that do not believe in God might see the power of the cross in our lives. Folks, I just got to say, I don't think Eli did this. He squandered his leadership. He squandered the authority and the influence and the voice that he had been given, both at his home and as a priest and as a judge. And I don't want to do that. What about you? I never want to be the guy that didn't show up and wonders why God didn't. See, God shows up when you show up connected to Christ. God has this beautiful way of working through ordinary, unschooled, under-talented, under-intelligent, under-expected people and saying, let me show what I can do with you. A person that trusts me and just simply shows up. That is the wonder of who Jesus is. And believers, folks, we have the greatest story to tell. And hear me on this. I believe that there's many people here today across all of our campuses that you've received that story. You've accepted the story of Jesus. But I wonder how many of us are really living that story and telling that story. Because see, it's one thing to receive it, but if you really want to have an impact, an influence in where God has placed you and at home in this world, you've got to live it and you've got to tell that story. You've got to. It starts at home and then it moves out into the spaces of life where you've been provided influence or a voice. And Eli failed on both accounts. If you've been around Northway for a while, you've heard us talk about this vision that we have. And it's to reach 1% of the greater Pittsburgh population for Christ, right? 2.3 million people live in the greater Pittsburgh area. God, what if, could we partner with you to reach 23,000 people at our various campuses around the city? And here's what I want you to know. I think it would be great to have that many people receive the story of Christ, 23,000 people participating at Northway, to receive that story. But the impact, I believe, on our region would be minimal if the only thing that happened would be we receive it. But what if 23,000 people started living that story and telling that story? Nurses and doctors around our town, teachers and businessmen and women, school board members and store owners, bankers and salespeople, high school students, college students, professors, waitresses, waiters, construction workers. What if 23,000 people in and around Pittsburgh began to live it and tell that story of Jesus in their homes and in their places where they've been given influence and a voice? If we have the courage to be identified with that story, and if you show up, God will honor and bless the impact, and it will be overwhelming. I am just absolutely convinced of it. I think that there are too many God followers that have received Christ, but they're not taking it home, and they're not living it where God's placed them in a seat or a place of influence where they have a voice. And I challenge myself, and I challenge everyone participating today to really consider, are you connected to Jesus and are you taking that home? And secondly, where has he given you a spot of influence? Where do you have a voice in your neighborhood, your classrooms, at your workplace? And you have the courage to be identified with Jesus and share that story. I'm going to ask everybody to stand up wherever you're worshiping today, I'm going to ask the campus leaders to step up at their campuses and close you out in prayer.